The first thing Private Shigeru Okada noticed was the light. It wasn't the blinding glare of a searchlight or the harsh interrogation lamps he had been warned about, but a soft, steady whiteness, clean, clinical, and almost serene. He had been dragged from the jungle days earlier, half delirious from blood loss, certain that capture meant the end of his life. Every story he had ever heard, every speech from his officers, every lesson in the Imperial Army had prepared him for cruelty. The Americans, they were told, were barbarians who would torture captives or leave them to die in filth. Yet here he was, lying on a crisp white sheet, the air smelling faintly of antiseptic and soap, and above him hovered the face of a young woman. Not a soldier, not a guard, but a nurse. Her hands were steady and warm as they unwrapped the blood-soaked bandages on his arm. She spoke softly to another nurse across the room, her English incomprehensible but her tone unmistakably gentle. When she noticed him watching, she offered a brief smile, a strange, disarming gesture that left Okada more unsettled than any interrogation could have. He tried to sit up, instinct telling him to bow or protest, but the pain in his shoulder forced him back down. The nurse placed a hand on his chest, not to restrain him but to reassure him. It was the first time in months anyone had touched him without violence. All around the ward, similar scenes were unfolding. Men who had braced themselves for punishment were instead being treated like patients. They were bathed, their wounds cleaned, their temperatures taken. Names were written on charts at the foot of each bed. The nurses moved with practiced efficiency, checking pulses and changing dressings, speaking in calm, measured voices that contrasted sharply with the chaos the prisoners had left behind on the battlefield. It was not just the care itself that was shocking. It was the ordinariness of it, the sense that tending to enemy soldiers was simply part of the job. For many of the wounded, this was their first encounter with a woman outside their own family. In pre-war Japan, gender roles were rigid, and women's presence in military affairs was almost non-existent. The idea that foreign women, women of the enemy, would not only be allowed near them, but would be responsible for their survival defied every expectation they had carried into war. Some turned their faces away in shame, convinced that accepting help from a woman was a deeper humiliation than defeat. Others refused food or medicine, muttering prayers or apologies to ancestors who might be watching. A few wept silently, unable to reconcile the image of the ruthless American enemy with the reality of the gentle hand stitching their wounds. The nurses, for their part, carried their own burdens into the ward. Many had brothers or husbands still fighting in the Pacific. Some had lost loved ones to Japanese attacks, and yet their duty demanded impartial care. They followed military medical protocols that made no distinction between friend and foe. A fever was treated, an infection was contained, a bullet wound cleaned and sutured. The enemy's uniform mattered no more than the color of the sheets. Some recorded their conflicted feelings in letters home, confessing that they had expected hatred, but instead felt pity, even compassion, for these young men who looked little different from the soldiers they had treated on American soil. By the second day, the initial tension in the ward began to shift. A prisoner who had refused morphine finally accepted a dose after watching a nurse sit patiently by his bedside for an hour, explaining its purpose through a translator. Another, too weak to eat, allowed himself to be spoon-fed broth by a woman younger than his sister. Whispered conversations began between patients in adjacent beds, their disbelief gradually giving way to curiosity. Why would the enemy waste medical supplies on men who had tried to kill them? Why were these women so determined to heal wounds inflicted by their own countrymen? The answers would come slowly, revealed not through lectures or propaganda, but through repeated gestures of care. Each cleaned wound, each carefully measured injection, each soft-spoken reassurance chipped away at the wall of hatred that years of war had built. For men like Okada, the infirmary became a place of deep confusion, an unexpected revelation. It was here, beneath the sterile light and the watchful care of their captors' nurses, that many Japanese prisoners first began to suspect that the enemy they had been taught to despise might not be the enemy they truly faced. Long before the first Japanese prisoners were carried into American infirmaries, long before the smell of antiseptic and the soft hand of enemy nurses challenged everything they believed, another code had been written deep into their bones. It was the code of Bushido, the warrior's way, and it governed not just how a soldier fought, but how he lived, how he died, and how he understood honor itself. In that worldview, capture was not survival. It was failure. Surrender was not mercy. It was shame so deep it stained not only the man himself but his family, his ancestors, and the nation he served. A soldier's death in battle was the ultimate proof of loyalty, his survival in enemy hands, the ultimate disgrace. This belief was not a shallow slogan pasted onto wartime propaganda. It was a philosophy cultivated over centuries, rooted in samurai tradition, and refined by state ideology in the early 20th century. By the time Japan embarked on its imperial conquest in Asia and the Pacific, the idea that surrender was worse than death had become a fundamental truth in every soldier's training. Recruits in imperial army barracks were drilled not only in rifle handling and bayonet charges, but in the moral expectations of warfare. Leaflets, speeches, and military manuals repeated the same lesson. It was better to fall on one sword than to be paraded as a captive. A man who allowed himself to be taken alive brought dishonor, not only to himself but to the emperor, the living embodiment of Japan itself. The weight of this belief was crushing. Soldiers carried cyanide capsules sewn into their uniforms. Pilots were told to reserve a final bullet for themselves if captured. On remote island garrisons, entire units would launch suicidal banzai charges rather than submit to the enemy. Civilians, too, absorbed the message. On Saipan and Okinawa, mothers threw themselves and their children from cliffs rather than face occupation. In such a climate, capture was not only a tactical defeat, but a profound existential collapse, a sign that one had failed as a man, as a warrior, and as a subject of the emperor. It was from this worldview that many Japanese soldiers enter American custody, broken not just in body but in spirit. They expected contempt, abuse, perhaps even execution, punishments that, in their eyes, they deserved. What they did not expect was kindness, much less from women. In the cultural imagination of Imperial Japan, the enemy's women were symbols of weakness and decadence. They were far removed from the stoic, dutiful image of Japanese womanhood, who supported the war effort from the home front with silence and sacrifice. The notion that enemy women, supposedly soft, frivolous, and foreign, would now be entrusted with their survival felt like an insult layered atop dishonor. The psychological dissonance was immense. Men who had been prepared to slit their own throats on the battlefield now found themselves lying helpless, as those same decadent women cleaned their wounds and offered them water. Some refused treatment altogether, turning their faces to the wall or pulling away from a nurse's touch. Others whispered apologies to comrades who had died honorably in battle, convinced that their own survival was a betrayal of everything they had fought for. There were men who wept silently as morphine dulled their pain, certain that even relief was more than they deserved. The shame did not end with the individual. In many cases, soldiers feared what their capture would mean for their families back home. Imperial propaganda had long warned that a captured man's name would be stricken from the family register, that his relatives would be shunned by neighbors, that his children would bear the stain of his disgrace. Even in the sterile safety of an American hospital, these fears gnawed at the prisoners. They imagined mothers weeping in shame, wives remarrying to erase the dishonor, fathers refusing to speak their names again. Being treated by enemy nurses did not soften these thoughts. It intensified them. It was as if every bandage applied, every pulse taken, was another reminder that they had failed to die as they were supposed to. Yet beneath that shame, another realization began to stir, one they could not yet name. If surrender was the worst fate imaginable, why were their captors, and their captors women, showing them mercy? If they were disgraced, why were they being treated as though their lives still had value? These questions did not erase centuries of indoctrination, but they cracked the first tiny fractures into a rigid belief system. The idea that an enemy might heal instead of harm, that survival could be an opportunity rather than a disgrace, remained unthinkable to many. But as the days passed and the nurses returned again and again to change their dressings and check their vitals, even the most hardened warriors could not entirely ignore the quiet contradiction unfolding before their eyes. For men who had marched through jungles with festering wounds wrapped in rags and splints made from bamboo, the first sight of an American field hospital felt almost unreal. It was not just the white tents and orderly rows of cots that astonished them, nor the humming generators that powered electric lights long after sunset. It was the scale of it all, The relentless machinery of care that seemed to move with the same precision and purpose as the tanks and bombers that had driven them from the battlefield. To the Japanese prisoners brought into the system, it was as if they had stumbled into another world, one where medicine was not a desperate improvisation, but a carefully orchestrated operation. By 1944, American military medicine had become one of the most advanced and organized in human history. The U.S. Army Medical Department, with its vast network of surgeons, nurses, orderlies, and support staff, operated as a force of its own. Hospitals were deployed like units, capable of setting up fully functioning surgical theaters within hours in advance. Ambulance convoys ferried the wounded from the front lines to rear area stabilization points, where teams worked around the clock to save limbs and lives that would have been lost in previous wars. And behind every operation, from the beaches of the Pacific to the deserts of North Africa, stood a colossal supply chain delivering everything from blood plasma and morphine to penicillin and surgical instruments. This commitment to care extended beyond their own soldiers. American adherence to the Geneva Conventions was not mere rhetoric, but a guiding principle that shaped military policy. The Red Cross was granted access to POW camps. Captured soldiers received medical examinations upon arrival. If they were wounded, they were treated according to the same protocols that governed care for U.S. troops. It was not charity, it was strategy. The American High Command understood that humane treatment of prisoners weakened enemy propaganda, encouraged surrenders, and built diplomatic goodwill that could outlast the war itself. But it was also a reflection of something deeper, a belief that even amid total war, certain standards of humanity could not be abandoned. For Japanese prisoners accustomed to scarcity and improvisation, the contrast could not have been starker. In their own army, medical care was often an afterthought, subordinate to needs of logistics and strategy. Supplies were limited, in field hospitals, when they existed at all, were rudimentary. Tents with straw mats for beds, crude surgical tools sterilized over campfires, morphine so rare that it was reserved for officers or withheld altogether. Many soldiers learned to operate with untreated infections or untreated fractures simply because no alternatives existed. In the Pacific jungles, countless men died not from bullets or bombs, but from malaria, dysentery, and infected wounds that would have been routine cases in an American facility. The American approach seemed to defy logic. Prisoners who had been shooting at their captors days earlier were now lying in clean beds, their wounds irrigated with antiseptic solution, their fevers monitored with mercury thermometers, their conditions charted meticulously on clipboards. Blood transfusions, a procedure almost unheard of in Japanese field medicine, were performed as a matter of course. Penicillin, the new miracle drug barely known to Japanese doctors, was administered widely to prevent infections. Even small details, like disposable gloves and individually packaged dressings, hinted at a level of industrial capacity and logistical sophistication that Japan could not hope to match. The Red Cross presence added another layer of complexity. Representatives visited camps, inspected medical facilities, and documented treatment standards. They brought additional supplies, books, even letters from home, all under the watchful eye of the U.S. military, which saw transparency as a weapon against enemy propaganda. The prisoners were astonished to see American guards consult with Red Cross personnel as equals, even defer to their recommendations. In their own military culture, such outside scrutiny would have been unthinkable, a sign of weakness or shame. Here, it was treated as a normal part of war. What truly stunned many, however, was the attitude of the medical personnel themselves. Surgeons did not rush through operations as if performing a distasteful duty. Nurses did not sneer or mutter insults under their breath. They spoke with the same calm professionalism to a Japanese prisoner as they did to a wounded American Marine. Some even attempted basic Japanese phrases to explain treatments or offer reassurance. The message was clear. Once under their care, a man was not an enemy. He was a patient. In the weeks and months that followed, this philosophy would leave a profound impression on the men it touched. For soldiers raised in a culture that prized sacrifice over survival and glorified death over defeat, the idea that their captors would invest time, skill, and vast resources into saving their lives was almost incomprehensible. Yet here, in the antiseptic glow of American medicine, they saw a different kind of strength, one that did not measure power in bullets or bayonets, but in the ability to preserve life, even the life of an enemy. And slowly, this revelation began to chip away at everything they thought they knew about war. The first thing Corporal Masato Takeda felt was the cold. It crept through the thin sheet covering him, rising from the metal frame of the cot beneath his back. Then came the pain, a dull, heavy throb radiating from his right leg, the kind that lives somewhere deeper than flesh and bone. He tried to move and found he couldn't. His throat was dry, his lips cracked. When he finally opened his eyes, the world above him was a haze of canvas and light, the faint smell of alcohol and iodine drifting through the air. For a few disoriented seconds, he thought he might already be dead, that this white, sterile place was some passage between worlds. Then a voice spoke softly beside him, and he knew he was still alive. It was a woman's voice, gentle, careful, speaking English words he could not understand. Takeda froze. The last thing he remembered was the chaos on Saipan. The deafening roar of artillery, the desperate charge of his unit, the blinding flash when the mortar shell tore into their position. He had expected to die there, as so many had. Yet here he was, his wounds bandaged, his fever breaking, and a woman, an American woman, was bending over him, changing his dressings with practiced hands. The shock was deeper than the injury. Takeda was 24 years old, the son of a farmer from Kagoshima Prefecture. Before the war, he had rarely spoken to women outside his own family. His mother and younger sister were the only ones who had ever cared for him when he was sick, and even then modesty and distance were expected. The idea of an enemy woman, a stranger, touching his body, lifting the sheet to check his wounds, pressing cool cloth against his fevered forehead, was almost unbearable. Shame flooded through him. He turned his face away, clenching his teeth, trying to disappear into the thin mattress. But the nurse did not recoil from his silence. She continued her work with quiet patience, humming under her breath as she peeled away the soiled bandages. When the pain made him wince, she paused and murmured something he could not understand, words meant to soothe, he realized. At one point, she placed a hand lightly on his shoulder, steadying him as she adjusted the splint on his leg. Her touch was firm but careful, as if she were handling something precious. He could not remember the last time anyone had touched him that way. As his mind cleared over the next several days, Takeda began to piece together what had happened. He had been found unconscious on the battlefield by American medics, who had dragged him to a field hospital set up near the beachhead. Surgeons had removed shrapnel from his thigh and stopped the bleeding just in time. The nurse who now visited his cot twice a day was named Anna, though he would not learn that until much later. She always spoke to him when she worked. Even though he understood almost nothing, she would hold up a bottle before giving him medicine, smile when he managed to nod a thanks, and point to the stitches when she checked for signs of infection. It was a ritual that, slowly and against his will, began to dissolve the dread that clung to him. Still, the shame remained. Takeda had been taught that capture was worse than death, that allowing an enemy to care for him was a humiliation beyond measure. He thought of his comrades who had chosen suicide rather than surrender. He thought of his father, who had told him that dying for the emperor was the highest honor man could achieve. And yet, here he was, alive, breathing, because the enemy had saved him, because a woman whose brother might have been killed by Japanese bombs was now tending his wounds. One night, as rain hammered the canvas overhead and the ward fell quiet, Takeda woke again to that same soft voice. Anna was there, changing his bandages by lamplight. For the first time, he found himself watching her hands instead of turning away. They moved with steady confidence, not hurried, not fearful. He realized she had probably done this hundreds of times, for Americans, for allies, and now for him. When she noticed his gaze, she met his eyes and smiled, a small, tired smile that felt disarmingly human. Without thinking, he whispered a single word he had not spoken since his capture, arigato. It was a simple exchange, and she likely did not understand. But in that moment, something shifted inside him. The woman he had been taught to hate was no longer just the enemy. She was a healer, a caretaker, a person who saw him not as a soldier or a prisoner, but as a man in need of help. That night, Corporal Masato Takeda realized that survival was not always shame, and that mercy could come from the most unexpected hands. The women who staffed the field hospitals and prison infirmaries had trained for many things, broken bones, battlefield trauma, infections that spread faster than doctors could treat them, but nothing had prepared them for the emotional terrain of caring for the enemy. They had enlisted or volunteered to serve their country, many of them fresh out of nursing school, driven by a sense of duty and patriotism. Some had joined after reading newspaper headlines about Pearl Harbor or the fall of Bataan, furious and determined to help their nation fight back. Others had brothers or cousins already overseas, and every telegram reporting a casualty made their commitment feel more personal. Yet as the war dragged on and the flow of wounded grew to include not only American soldiers, but also Japanese prisoners, they found themselves on a battlefield that had nothing to do with bullets or bayonets. It was a war of conscience, one fought quietly in sterile wards under the dim glow of lantern light. Lieutenant Margaret Doyle still remembered a telegram that had arrived at her family's farmhouse in Kansas. Her younger brother Thomas, a Marine, had been killed on Tarawa. She had enlisted just weeks later, driven by grief as much as patriotism. The first time she treated a Japanese prisoner, a young man no older than Thomas, with a bandaged leg and terrified eyes, the weight of that loss came crashing back. Her hands trembled as she cleaned his wound. For a moment, she saw not the patient before her, but the face of her brother, the boy who had never come home. It would have been easy to hate, to walk away, to let bitterness guide her, but she was a nurse, and nurses did not choose which lives were worth saving. The same story repeated itself across countless wards. Many of the women who now found themselves tending to Japanese soldiers had lost someone to the very army these men had served. Some had sweethearts killed in the Philippines, fathers who never returned from Wake Island, or childhood friends listed as missing after Midway. And yet, they were sworn to uphold a code of care that made no distinction between ally and adversary. The Geneva Conventions demanded humane treatment of prisoners, but for most nurses, the motivation ran deeper than legal obligation. It was a matter of professional ethics, of believing that the value of a life did not vanish with the color of a uniform. Still, the emotional toll was real. Some nights, nurses wept quietly behind the curtains of their quarters, unable to reconcile their private grief with their public duty. Others confessed in letters home that they struggled with resentment, that they had to remind themselves again and again that these were patients, not enemies. A few admitted that they prayed before every shift, asking for strength to offer compassion where their hearts felt none. And yet every morning, they returned to the ward, adjusted pillows, checked pulses, changed dressings, and spoke in gentle tones even to men who fought against everything they loved. There were moments of unexpected humanity. Two, small, fragile connections that transcended the violence of the past. A nurse might notice a prisoner's hand shaking as she approached with a syringe and offer a reassuring smile. Another might learn a few words of Japanese to explain a treatment or answer a question. One prisoner, delirious with fever, called out for his mother, and a nurse sat by his bedside through the night, wiping sweat from his brow until he calmed. These gestures cost nothing, but they mattered deeply. For the prisoners, they were glimpses of compassion they had been taught did not exist among enemies. For the nurses, they were reminders that beneath the uniforms and ideologies, these men were not monsters. They were sons and brothers too. Some nurses even found their perceptions shifting. They had entered the war believing the enemy was ruthless and fanatical, but up close, they saw fear, vulnerability, and sorrow that mirrored their own. The realization did not erase their anger or dull their grief, but it complicated it, adding layers of emotions that had once seemed simple. This was a different kind of battlefield, one where victory was measured not in territory gained or enemies defeated, but in wounds healed and lives preserved. By the end of the war, many nurses would remember their time in the POW wards as some of the most difficult and meaningful work of their lives. They had gone to war to serve their country, but in those quiet antiseptic rooms, they had served something larger, a belief that humanity did not end at the edge of uniform, that compassion was not a sign of weakness, and that even in war, mercy had a place. It was a lesson they carried home with them long after the fighting stopped. And for the men who had once been their enemies, it was a lesson they would never forget. The mornings in the prisoner infirmaries began not with the bark of commands or the clatter of rifles, but with the steady rhythm of care. At dawn, when the rest of the camp stirred to the sound of boots and shouted orders, the medical tents were already alive with quieter sounds. The rustle of bed sheets being changed, the hiss of steam sterilizers, the measured footsteps of nurses moving from cot to cot with trays of instruments and bottles of medicine. There was an order to it all, a choreography practice. So often it had become second nature. Every patient was charted, every fever logged, every wound inspected. Even here, amid the wreckage of war, the routines of healing unfolded with precision. At precisely 6:30 each morning, the nurses began their rounds. They started by checking temperatures, slipping glass thermometers under tongues and into armpits, waiting silently for the mercury to rise. The words they exchanged with each other were clinical and precise, yet even without understanding the language, the Japanese prisoners could sense the care beneath them. 102, a nurse might murmur as she scribbled a note on a clipboard, "We'll bring the fever down." The phrase, repeated so often became a refrain, seemed almost absurd to some of the patients. In their world, an enemy's fever was a sign of weakness to be exploited, not a condition to be treated. Next came the morphine, administered with practiced hands. It dulled the pain of shrapnel wounds, broken bones, and surgical incisions. Many prisoners hesitated when the syringes appeared. Rumors had circulated among them since capture that the Americans would poison their food, experiment on them, or leave them to die slowly as punishment. The reality was far stranger. The nurses explained the medicine with gestures, sometimes pantomiming relief by miming sleep or tracing a calming hand over their own foreheads. Reluctantly, the men agreed, and when the drug eased their suffering, confusion followed. It was difficult to hate an enemy who stopped your pain. The work continued throughout the day. Wounds were irrigated with antiseptic solution. Dressings changed with meticulous attention. Splints were adjusted. Stitches inspected for signs of infection. In cases of severe injury, nurses shaved heads to treat scalp wounds or carefully removed gangrenous tissue to save a limb. For many of the prisoners, the very sight of such resources, sterile gauze, surgical scissors, antibiotics, was astonishing. They had grown used to improvisation. Bandages torn from shirts, disinfectant brewed from boiled herbs, amputations performed without anesthesia. Here, everything seemed infinite, from supplies on the shelves to the patience of the people wielding them. It was not only physical needs that were met. Some nurses, moved by the isolation of their patients, began writing letters on their behalf. They would sit at a bedside with pen and paper, while a prisoner dictated haltingly in broken English or through an interpreter. Most of the messages were simple: reassurances to mothers, apologies to wives, pleas for news of children, but the act itself carried a weight that transcended language. In a world defined by violence, someone was willing to give them a voice again. Still, acceptance did not come easily. Many prisoners found themselves caught between gratitude and humiliation. They had been taught that Americans were brutal and uncivilized, capable of unimaginable cruelty. School children back home had been told that captured soldiers would be tortured or starved, their bodies displayed as warnings. Every spoonful of broth offered by a nurse, every cool cloth laid across a fever brow, clashed violently with that image. Some men refused treatment for days, convinced it was a trick. Others whispered prayers before swallowing medicine, unsure whether they were accepting healing or signing their own death warrants. Gradually, though, doubt gave way to reluctant trust. The evidence was too overwhelming to ignore. No one was being poisoned. No one was being beaten. The enemy who had dropped bombs on their cities now listened patiently to their groans of pain. The women they had imagined as distant and frivolous now carried bedpans, scrubbed infection from their wounds, and coaxed them to eat. Even when a prisoner died, and many did, despite the care, the nurses covered the body with a clean sheet and bowed their heads before it was taken away. Respect for life, it seemed, did not end at the edge of the battlefield. The transformation was slow but profound. The daily rituals, thermometers clicking against glass, morphine syringes emptied with practiced precision, handwritten letters folded into envelopes, became the rhythm of a new kind of existence. The men who had once sworn to die rather than fall into enemy hands found themselves looking forward to the soft footfalls of the nurses as they made their rounds. Each small act of care chipped away at the myths they had carried with them into war. And as they watched the Americans treat even their fevers as something worth fighting, a deeper realization began to take root. Perhaps strength did not always wear a uniform or wield a rifle. Perhaps, in its own quiet way, it could wear a white apron and carry a thermometer too. The decision to care for enemy prisoners with the same diligence and attention given to American soldiers was not a matter of sentiment. It was a deliberate choice, one shaped as much by strategy and law as by compassion. Long before the first Japanese prisoner was carried into a field hospital, the framework that would dictate their treatment had already been written into international agreements and military doctrine. The Geneva Conventions, revised in 1929 and ratified by the United States before the war began, laid out clear standards. Prisoners of war would be treated humanely, provided with adequate food, shelter, and medical care, and protected from violence, intimidation, and public humiliation. These were not vague ideals, but legally binding obligations, ones that the U.S. military took seriously not only for moral reasons, but also because adherence served a larger purpose. For American commanders, the humane treatment of prisoners was a weapon of a different kind. They understood that wars were not fought solely with bullets and bombs, but also with ideas, and that reputation could influence an enemy's willingness to fight or surrender. If soldiers believed that capture meant certain death, they would resist to the last man, costing thousands of additional lives. But if word spread that American camps offered fair treatment, medical care, and dignity, more enemy troops might lay down their arms. This was not speculation, it was a calculation, and as the Pacific wore ground on, that calculation proved correct. Intelligence reports indicated that Japanese soldiers who had once sworn to die rather than surrender were hesitating, influenced by accounts, sometimes whispered by prisoners who had been repatriated through prisoner exchanges, of the unexpectedly humane conditions in U.S. custody. The philosophy extended beyond battlefield pragmatism. American leaders believed that how they treated prisoners would shape the post-war world they would have to build. Memories of World War I were still fresh, and many policymakers were determined to avoid the mistakes of Versailles, punitive policies, and cycles of humiliation that sowed the seeds of future conflict. In their view, humane treatment of captives was not just about winning the war, but about laying the groundwork for a more stable peace. If former enemies returned home with stories of decency and respect, it might soften public opinion, open channels of dialogue, and make reconciliation possible when the guns finally fell silent. This approach filtered down into every level of the military medical system. Field hospitals and POW infirmaries were not merely extensions of battlefield logistics. They were also instruments of foreign policy. Surgeons operated on Japanese prisoners with the same care they used for wounded Americans. Nurses were instructed to follow identical treatment protocols regardless of the patient's nationality. Medical supplies were rationed and distributed based on medical need, not allegiance. Even in the chaos of battle, triage officers were reminded of their obligations. A wounded enemy soldier was still a human being under protection of international law. To the Japanese prisoners who found themselves under American care, these policies seemed almost impossible to believe. Many had grown up in a military culture that disregarded the very idea of prisoner rights. The Imperial Japanese Army had not ratified the Geneva Conventions, and Japanese POW camps were notorious for their harsh conditions and lack of medical treatment. In that world, captivity was synonymous with degradation, and the concept of an enemy doctor laboring to save a prisoner's life was unthinkable. Yet here, under the Red Cross flag, they were receiving blood transfusions, surgical interventions, and daily nursing care that some had never experienced even in their own army. The Americans, too, were aware of the power of optics. Red Cross visits were welcomed and documented. Journalists occasionally toured POW hospitals, photographing scenes of captured soldiers receiving treatment from American medical staff. These images were meant for more than public relations. They were a message to the world and to the enemy that America fought differently. Its strength was not measured solely in industrial output or military might, but also in its capacity for restraint and humanity. In practice, this adherence to law and principle often transcended even the most bitter personal feelings. A surgeon whose brother had been killed at Pearl Harbor might find himself suturing the wounds of a man who had once aimed a rifle at him. A nurse grieving a fiancé lost in the Philippines might hold a hand of a feverish prisoner through the night. These acts were not easy, but they were deliberate, and they embodied a belief that the character of a nation was revealed not in how it treated its allies, but in how it treated its enemies. Over time, the prisoners themselves began to understand that what they were witnessing was more than just medical care. It was a philosophy, a conviction that civilization did not end at the edge of a battlefield. The same nation that had unleashed overwhelming force across the Pacific was also willing to bandage the wounds of the men it had defeated. In that contradiction lay a lesson many Japanese soldiers would carry with them long after the war. That power, when tempered by principle, could achieve far more than fear alone. And as they prepared for the uncertain future that awaited them after captivity, that lesson, born in sterile tents and whispered through acts of care, began to reshape how they thought about war, defeat, and the humanity of their former enemies. The first thing many American nurses noticed about their Japanese patients was not their wounds, but their apologies. They apologized for bleeding on the sheets. They apologized for needing food. Some even apologized simply for surviving. It was a reaction that puzzled the medical staff at first. These were men who had been dragged from battlefields, many half dead when they arrived, yet they seemed more ashamed of being alive than they were grateful for the chance to heal. It did not take long for the nurses to understand that the real injury they were treating was not physical at all. It was a deep, corrosive shame of capture. Corporal Nakamoto was one of those men. Pulled from the wreckage of a jungle skirmish with shattered leg and a punctured lung, he lay on his cot staring at the ceiling for days, refusing food and water. When a nurse offered him morphine, he turned his head away. "No," he whispered through cracked lips, using one of the few English words he knew. No. At first they assumed it was fear. Fear of poisoning, fear of trickery. But when an interpreter arrived and asked him why, his answer was startling in its simplicity. "I do not deserve to live." It was a phrase repeated by many prisoners in those wards, spoken in different dialects, but always carrying the same weight. To them, survival was not a triumph. It was a betrayal. The cultural roots of this guilt ran deep. From the earliest days of their training, Japanese soldiers had been taught that surrender was dishonorable, that captivity was worse than death. Stories of warriors who chose suicide over capture were held up as the highest examples of loyalty. Officers drilled into their men that even a wounded soldier could still crawl forward and die usefully, taking one more enemy with him. Living in a foreign hospital bed, while the war continued elsewhere, was the very opposite of that ideal. It was weakness made visible. It was failure laid bare. For the nurses tasked with their care, the challenge was unlike anything they had faced before. How do you heal someone who believes he deserves to die? Some wrote about it in their diaries at night, struggling to make sense of a strange mixture of stoicism and sorrow they encountered every day. "He would not let me touch his wound." One nurse wrote of a patient whose arm was infected and in danger of amputation. "He bowed his head and said he had shamed his family. He would rather lose the arm, perhaps even die, than let me help him." Another described a prisoner who burst into tears when handed a bowl of soup, repeating over and over that he was unworthy of such kindness. Some refused even the most basic comforts. They pushed away blankets, rejected painkillers, and lay still for hours without speaking. Others whispered apologies to nurses themselves, bowing awkwardly from their beds, as if trying to erase their own presence. Many did not meet the nurses' eyes, unwilling to accept the reality of being tended to by foreign women, women whose brothers and husbands might have died fighting them. To accept that help felt like adding insult to their already unbearable shame. But time, patience, and persistence began to erode the wall of guilt. The nurses did not scold or lecture. They returned day after day, with fresh bandages and warm meals, with steady hands and calm voices. They spoke gently even when their words went untranslated. They held thermometers under arms and pressed cool cloths against fevered brows. And slowly, something began to change. A man who had once refused morphine accepted a small dose to sleep. Another, too ashamed to eat, began sipping broth. One prisoner, after weeks of silence, murmured a faint "thank you" in broken English. The change was not dramatic. It was 1,000 small concessions that, together, marked the beginning of trust. For some, the shame never fully vanished, but it softened into something else, a recognition that survival did not have to mean disgrace. The nurses, without ever meaning to, were teaching them that there was no dishonor in living, no betrayal in allowing another human being to care for you. It was a lesson that took time to sink in, but once it did, it changed the atmosphere of the wards. Conversations became longer. Smiles, once rare, began to appear. And where there had once been whispered apologies, there were now hesitant questions about the future. The shame of survival never disappeared entirely from those rooms. It clung to the men like a second wound. But as the weeks turned to months, it no longer defined them. Beneath the weight of guilt, they discovered something unexpected. That survival itself could be a form of courage. That to endure, even in defeat, was its own kind of honor. And that perhaps, in accepting care from those they once called enemies, they were learning a deeper lesson about humanity than the one they had carried into the war. The nurses and doctors who worked in the prisoner infirmaries quickly learned that their patients carried more than wounds. They carried stories. Every broken bone, every festering infection, every scar told a chapter of the war that was unfolding far beyond the barbed wire. For the medical staff, treating the bodies of captured Japanese soldiers was not just an act of care. It was a way to understand the enemy on a level deeper than maps and intercepted messages could ever provide. Healing became, in its own quiet way, a form of reconnaissance. From the very beginning, the signs were unmistakable. The first groups of prisoners brought into American custody in 1943 had already shown troubling indicators. Hollow cheeks, brittle hair, and the gauntness of men who had been running on inadequate rations for months. As the war dragged on, these symptoms grew more pronounced. By 1944, many of the captives arriving in POW hospitals were severely underweight, their bodies ravaged not only by battle but by chronic malnutrition. Some showed signs of beriberi, a disease caused by vitamin deficiency. Others had scurvy, their gums bleeding from lack of fresh produce. These were not the hardened, unstoppable warriors American propaganda had described. They were men whose armies could no longer feed them properly. Doctors took careful notes. Each examination added to a growing picture of an empire straining under the weight of a total war it could no longer sustain. The prevalence of untreated infections, for example, spoke volumes about Japan's collapsing medical infrastructure. Many wounds that should have been cleaned and sutured in the field had been left to fester. Bullets were sometimes left inside bodies because there were no surgeons available to remove them. Limbs had been amputated with crude instruments, and the scars that remained bore witness to the scarcity of proper anesthesia. Even dental health, or the lack of it, told a story. Decaying teeth and severe gum disease indicated a diet increasingly reliant on preserved or foraged food, suggesting supply lines that were overextended or broken. The intelligence gleaned from these observations was subtle but invaluable. Reports compiled from medical assessments were shared with military intelligence units, who pieced them together with intercepted communications and field reports. Patterns began to emerge. Japanese forces were suffering from logistical breakdowns on multiple fronts. Troop rations had been cut to subsistence levels. Medical units were short on supplies, and field hospitals were often non-existent. The physical condition of the prisoners confirmed what aerial reconnaissance and intercepted codes had hinted at. Japan's vast empire was beginning to buckle from within. For the nurses on the ground, these discoveries were deeply human as well as strategic. They saw firsthand the evidence of a war that had pushed an entire nation past its limits. They treated soldiers whose bodies were riddled with parasites from drinking contaminated water, whose skin bore the scars of jungle infections untreated for weeks, whose lungs wheezed from tuberculosis left to spread unchecked. Each case added nuance to their understanding of the enemy. Not as faceless soldiers, but as men fighting under impossible conditions, sustained more by discipline and belief than by adequate supplies. Sometimes the most revealing clues came from the smallest details. A nurse might notice that a prisoner's boots were worn nearly to shreds, patched and repatched with scraps of canvas. Another might remark on the rough fabric of a uniform, its quality far inferior to what had been issued earlier in the war. Even the types of wounds changed as the conflict dragged on. Early prisoners bore injuries from rifle fire and artillery shrapnel. Later ones were more likely to suffer from malnutrition-related fractures or infections from poorly executed field surgeries. Each detail spoke to a military machine that was fraying at its edges. The prisoners themselves, often without realizing it, confirmed these conclusions. In moments of trust or delirium, some spoke about dwindling rations, units stranded without resupply, or medical officers forced to improvise with whatever they could find. Others hinted at low morale, describing comrades weakened by disease or dying from treatable injuries simply because there were no antibiotics to be found. Every word, every scar, every symptom painted a fuller picture of a nation locked in a war it could no longer afford to fight. The irony was not lost on the medical staff. In trying to heal their enemies, they were also learning how to defeat them. But the intelligence they gathered was not just about weaknesses to exploit. It also offered a sobering glimpse into the human cost of Japan's war effort. The men lying in those hospital beds were the embodiment of an empire's desperation, emaciated, exhausted, yet still clinging to the ideals they've been taught to die for. And as doctors stitched wounds and nurses spoon-fed broth into trembling hands, they understood that each act of care was also an act of discovery. Every fever brought down, every infection treated, every scar examined told them a little more about the world beyond the infirmary walls, a world where Japan's armies were not just being beaten by American firepower, but by hunger, disease, and the slow collapse of the systems meant to sustain them. The first letter Eleanor Hayes wrote home from the POW hospital was short, almost mechanical. She had been in the Pacific barely 3 weeks, and already the routine of treating wounded men, many of them Japanese, felt like something she had stumbled into rather than chosen. They brought in another group today. She wrote to her mother in Iowa. Most of them are younger than I expected. Thin, quiet. They don't look like the enemy I imagined. She didn't know what else to say. How could she explain that the same hands that once tied bandages around her brother's wounds in a stateside training hospital were now tending to men he might have fought, or even killed, had he lived long enough to see deployment? In the early weeks, the letters were full of contradictions. Eleanor confessed her anger, still raw from the news that her childhood friend Robert had died aboard the USS Arizona. She admitted that sometimes, when she was cleaning a prisoner's wounds, she thought of the men who had burned alive in that harbor. And yet, she wrote in the same breath, it was impossible not to see the humanity in the faces of those lying helpless before her. One of them thanked me today, she told her mother. He barely speaks English, but he said, "Thank you," as I changed his bandages. I didn't know how to feel. I wanted to hate him, but I couldn't. The longer Eleanor served, the more her letters shifted from anger to observation. She described the small, surprising details that textbooks and propaganda never mentioned. One man wept silently as she brought him soup, ashamed to be alive. Another flinched when she reached for his hand, as if expecting violence instead of care. "They're terrified of us," she wrote one night, her handwriting shaky and uneven. Not just of being captured, of being touched. It's as if they've been taught we're monsters. The thought unsettled her. She had spent so long thinking of the Japanese as a faceless enemy that the realization they saw Americans the same way made her question everything she thought she knew about the war. Eleanor also wrote about her own transformation, though she didn't always see it happening at the time. At first, every wound she cleaned felt like an act of reluctant duty. But soon she found herself lingering by bedsides, asking interpreters for words in Japanese, so she could reassure her patients more clearly. She began learning their names and stories. One had been a teacher before the war, another a farmer with 3 children. They were not so different, she realized, from the boys she'd grown up with in Cedar Rapids. They miss home too, she wrote. They dream of going back. They worry about their families. It's strange, the more I know them, the harder it is to hate them. Some of her letters were darker, filled with the emotional weight she could not share with anyone in camp. She described nights when she sat awake, wondering whether the men she was saving might one day fight again. She confessed the guilt she felt each time she smiled at a prisoner, as if kindness itself were a betrayal of the men who had died. "Sometimes I think about Robert," she wrote on a rain-soaked evening in June, "and I wonder if he'd be angry with me for saving their lives. But then I think about how much he loved this country, and how he believed it stood for something better. Maybe this is part of that." By the end of her first year overseas, Eleanor's tone had changed completely. Her letters were still heavy with the realities of war, the endless stream of wounded, the nightmares, the exhaustion, but they were also filled with a sense of purpose. "I've learned something here," she wrote in one of her final letters before being reassigned. It's easy to fight when you're far away. It's harder when the enemy is lying in front of you, too weak to speak. But that's when it matters most. That's when you find out who you really are. Her mother kept those letters tucked inside a wooden box on the kitchen shelf, reading them over and over even after Eleanor returned home. They became a record, not just a one-woman service, but a profound shift in perspective. Through Eleanor's words, the story of the war changed shape. It was no longer just a struggle between nations, but a series of small, human encounters, each one a chance to replace hatred with understanding. And though she never thought of herself as heroic, her letters told a different story, of a young nurse who learned that saving an enemy's life could be just as patriotic as taking up arms, and that healing, in its quiet way, could change the course of a war as surely as any victory on the battlefield. The ward was a world of contradictions, a place where two civilizations that had spent years trying to destroy each other were now forced to meet at the most human level. Every day, those contradictions revealed themselves in small, sometimes startling ways, gestures that made no sense to the Americans and acts of kindness that bewildered the Japanese. What began as confusion often became frustration, and yet, over time, these misunderstandings gave way to moments of quiet connection that neither side had expected. One morning, Nurse Eleanor Hayes, the same one who had been writing letters home about her conflicted feelings, approached a bed where a young prisoner named Satoshi was recovering from a chest wound. She was carrying a tray with medicine and fresh bandages, prepared to change his dressing. But as she reached for his blanket, he recoiled sharply, turning away from her and muttering a phrase she didn't understand. When the interpreter arrived a few minutes later, the explanation left her stunned. Satoshi, barely 21, had never been touched by a woman outside his family. For him, the idea of a foreign woman tending to his body was unthinkable, an affront to both his modesty and his culture. Eleanor's instinct was to reassure him, but instead, she stepped back, bowed her head slightly, and asked a male orderly on duty to assist her. The next day, when she returned, Satoshi allowed her to change the bandages. It was a small step, but it had required patience, respect, and a willingness to meet him halfway. Other misunderstandings were more tragic. A soldier named Kenji, his body riddled with shrapnel, asked an interpreter to convey a simple request: permission to die. He believed that surviving while his comrades had perished was shameful, and that accepting care from the enemy was a disgrace worse than death itself. The nurses were shaken. They tried to explain that their duty was to preserve life, not end it, but Kenji would not eat or drink for days. Only after Eleanor sat with him every evening, speaking softly even though he understood little, did his resolve weaken. He began accepting broth, and eventually he agreed to surgery to remove the shrapnel. Saving him required not just medicine, but patience, and the stubborn belief that his life was worth saving, even if he could not yet see it himself. There were also moments of unintentional comedy that, in their own way, became bridges between two worlds. One afternoon, a nurse handed a prisoner a glass thermometer and gestured for him to place it under his tongue. Instead, he bowed politely and tried to hand it back, believing it was a gift. On another occasion, a nurse offered a spoonful of liquid medicine, and the patient, assuming it was poison, insisted on bowing and thanking her for the honor of receiving it. Laughter broke the tension in both cases, and the nurses began using humor as a tool, exaggerating gestures, miming instructions, and sometimes even drawing crude sketches on scraps of paper to communicate. Slowly, misunderstandings that once caused anxiety became opportunities for connection. The bowing was constant. It puzzled the Americans at first. Why did the prisoners bow from their beds, sometimes dozens of times a day? But as weeks passed, the nurses began to understand that these gestures were not just signs of politeness, but deeply ingrained expressions of respect and apology. Some prisoners bowed to express gratitude for care they did not feel worthy of. Others bowed as acts of contrition for having lost the war or for needing help from their enemies. Over time, many of the nurses began bowing back, an awkward motion at first, but one that carried immense meaning. These small acts, repeated hundreds of times in the quiet spaces between treatments, softened the walls between captor and captive. Language barriers created their own challenges. Misunderstandings over doses, procedures, and even simple instructions were frequent, but they also pushed the nurses to become more creative in how they cared for their patients. They learned key Japanese words: pain, food, sleep, safe. And the prisoners, in turn, began picking up fragments of English. A wordless vocabulary emerged. A nod meant trust. A raised hand meant fear. A bowed head meant gratitude. It was clumsy, imperfect communication, but it was enough. In time, the war became more than a place of healing. It became a classroom where two cultures, once enemies, learned about each other in the most intimate way possible. Not through treaties or diplomacy, but through the daily rituals of survival. Bandages were applied with a little more gentleness. Meals were shared with small smiles. A prisoner might murmur, "Thank you," in halting English, and a nurse might reply with a carefully practiced arigato. Each gesture, each exchange, each moment of mutual understanding was a tiny bridge across a vast gulf. The war outside still raged, but inside those wards, the battle lines blurred. What had begun as a clash of cultures slowly became something else, a fragile, human dialogue written not in words or treaties, but in the language of care. And though no one there would have dared call it peace, it was perhaps the closest thing they had ever known. The shift began quietly, almost imperceptibly, as if neither side wanted to admit that something deeper was happening. At first, it was nothing more than a few halting English words spoken in broken accents by men who, weeks earlier, would not have spoken to their captors at all. Then it was the small folded cranes that began appearing on bedside tables, carefully creased from scraps of medical supply paper. The nurses never saw who made them, but they always appeared in the same place, next to the water pitcher or resting on a folded blanket, a silent offering that needed no translation. It was in these tiny gestures, born from a moment of vulnerability and gratitude, that a strange new relationship began to grow between captor and captive, healer and healed. The first time Nurse Eleanor found a paper crane, she thought it was a mistake. It was perched at the edge of a patient's cot, delicate and precise, its wings outstretched as if ready to take flight. The patient, a quiet former infantryman named Hiroshi, pretended not to notice when she held it up. Only when she placed it back on the table did he glance up and nod once, almost imperceptibly. It was a gesture that seemed insignificant at the time, but to Eleanor, it felt heavier than any thank you she could have received in words. From then on, the cranes became a quiet language of their own, a language of respect for men who had no other way to express it. Acts of defiance were often the first step toward connection. Learning English, for instance, was technically discouraged by some of the camp's officers, who feared that speaking the enemy's language would be seen as a betrayal of their homeland. Yet small groups of prisoners began to do it anyway. They asked nurses the names of objects, repeating the words back clumsily until they stuck. They pointed to their wounds and asked, "Good." They learned thank you, better, friend. One man even began collecting scraps of old newspapers from the trash to practice reading, asking for help sounding out the unfamiliar letters. For men raised to believe that even acknowledging the enemy was shameful, this was rebellion, not against their homeland, but against the hatred that had once defined them. The nurses, for their part, responded in kind. They began to leave little notes written in phonetic Japanese. "Okay," beside a wound that was healing well, or "Eat," near a bowl of soup left untouched. Some began bringing small items from home, a photograph of a family farm, a postcard from a hometown church, a magazine clipping with pictures of New York or Chicago. These tokens were more than attempts at conversation. They were invitations to see one another as people rather than enemies. And though the prisoners rarely spoke about it, they cherished these moments of shared humanity. A photograph passed around a ward could spark hours of whispered conversation. A single English phrase learned one day might become a bridge to a deeper exchange the next. The origami cranes multiplied. They appeared not just on bedside tables, but on window sills and supply carts, tucked inside folded sheets or slipped into pockets when nurses weren't looking. Some were crude and uneven, others folded with painstaking care. Each one told a story of gratitude that words could not capture, of a relationship that had begun to transcend the violence that had brought them together. Over time, the nurses came to see these small tokens as something more profound than mere thanks. They were symbols of surrender, not of armies or nations, but of hatred itself. Perhaps the most touching gesture came from a group of convalescent prisoners who, upon their release from the infirmary, presented the staff with a small wooden plaque they had carved using bits of scavenged material. The inscription, written in careful English, read simply, "We live because you cared." It was the kind of sentence that would have been unthinkable in the first days of their captivity. Yet here it was, carved into wood, a tangible reminder of how far they had all come. These acts, small, fragile, and often unnoticed outside the walls of the infirmary, carried a power that neither side fully understood at the time. They were signs of something larger unfolding beneath the surface. The slow dismantling of prejudice, the quiet rebuilding of trust, the emergence of respect where hatred once lived. For the prisoners, learning the enemy's language or leaving a handmade gift was a way of reclaiming their dignity on their own terms. For the nurses, accepting those gestures was a way of acknowledging that their work had become something greater than medicine. By the time many of the prisoners were healthy enough to return to their barracks, the dynamic in the ward had shifted completely. They still bowed, still spoke haltingly, still carried the weight of defeat. But there was a lightness now, too, a mutual recognition that they had shared something that transcended the war outside. A paper crane on a windowsill, a word spoken in a foreign tongue, a smile exchanged across a language barrier. These were not just tokens of peace. They were proof that even in the aftermath of unimaginable violence, grace could take root one small act at a time. For the officers, the experience of captivity carried a deeper humiliation than it did for the ordinary soldiers. These were men who had devoted their lives to the imperial cause, who had studied strategy and doctrine, and who had lectured their men about the sanctity of Bushido, the warrior's code that placed honor above life itself. They had sworn to die before surrendering, and yet here they were, alive, disarmed, and treated not as trophies of war, but as patients. It was a reversal of everything they had been taught to expect, and it struck at the core of their identity as warriors and leaders. What unsettled them most was not the defeat itself, but the fact that the victors were showing mercy, and doing so with scale and efficiency they could scarcely comprehend. Colonel Tadao Ishikawa had been an instructor at the Imperial Army Academy before the war. He had lectured endlessly on the superiority of Japanese spirit over Western decadence, teaching that a society softened by comfort would inevitably collapse in the face of true sacrifice. Yet as he walked on crutches through the ward one afternoon, watching American nurses administer blood transfusions to wounded prisoners and surgeons labor over men who, days earlier, had tried to kill their countrymen, he felt a gnawing doubt he could not ignore. "If this is weakness," he muttered to a fellow officer beside him, "then we are doomed." It was not a sentiment born of bitterness, but of revelation. The more the officers observed the American system of care, the more they realized that it was underpinned by something they had never fully understood, a vast, organized strength that extended far beyond the battlefield. It was one thing to produce tanks and aircraft in staggering numbers, but to mobilize doctors, nurses, medical equipment, and pharmaceuticals on this scale, even for the enemy, spoke of a level of national capacity that Japan could not hope to match. They had believed that their willingness to die gave them the upper hand. Now they saw that the Americans' ability to preserve life, even the lives of those who opposed them, was a different and perhaps more formidable kind of power. The contradictions piled up in ways they could not ignore. They had been told that the Americans were selfish and materialistic, yet here were soldiers sharing their rations with men who had been shooting at them weeks earlier. They had been taught that enemy women were frivolous and weak, yet here were those same women enduring long hours and bloody work to save Japanese lives. They had believed that industrial societies lacked spirit, but now they saw that spirit expressed in a relentless, disciplined pursuit of care, an unshakable belief that even an enemy deserved dignity. The entire ideological scaffolding that had supported their understanding of war was beginning to crumble. Some officers struggled against the dawning realization. They clung stubbornly to the rhetoric they had repeated for decades, insisting that American mercy was a facade, a trick to weaken their resolve. But the evidence was all around them. In the antiseptic smell of the infirmaries, in the meticulous records kept for each prisoner's treatment, in the daily deliveries of medical supplies that never seemed to run out. The Americans were not simply showing mercy. They were demonstrating control. They could afford to save lives because their society produced enough wealth, organization, and manpower to make it possible. Others began to think more deeply. If a nation could fight a global war on multiple fronts while still dedicating resources to healing its enemies, what did that say about the nature of power in the modern age? If Japan's strength lay in its willingness to sacrifice, America's lay in its ability to sustain, to build systems so vast and resilient that even war could not exhaust them. That realization was more unsettling than defeat itself. It suggested that Japan had been fighting not just an opposing army, but an entirely different conception of what it meant to be strong. Even small details reinforced this uncomfortable truth. Officers noticed that the nurses worked in shifts that ensured no one became too exhausted to perform their duties. Supplies arrived on schedule, never delayed, never rationed to the point of desperation. There were contingency plans for every conceivable emergency. It was a kind of order and preparation that Bushido, for all its emphasis on courage and self-sacrifice, had never prioritized. The officers began to understand that while their soldiers had been taught to die bravely, the Americans had been taught to plan thoroughly, to build systems that could adapt and endure. And in the long run, it was that endurance that was winning the war. By the time word of Japan's mounting defeats began filtering into the camp, the ideological shift among many of the officers was nearly complete. They no longer spoke of American weakness with scorn, but with something closer to awe. The code they had once believed unassailable now seemed narrow and outdated, forged for a different kind of war in a different century. They had measured strength and willingness to die, but their captors had shown them another measure, the capacity to sustain life, even that of an enemy, without hesitation. And in the quiet of the infirmary, surrounded by the hum of machines and the steady footsteps of nurses, they understood a hard truth. The world was changing, and nations that clung only to the sword would not survive it. The end of the war did not arrive with the thunder of artillery or the roar of engines. It came quietly, almost anticlimactically, in the form of a radio broadcast that crackled through the barracks one humid August afternoon. Word spread quickly from bunk to bunk. Emperor Hirohito had spoken. Japan was surrendering. For many of the prisoners, the announcement was harder to comprehend than the war itself. The empire that had once promised victory or glorious death had fallen, and with it, the ideals they had built their lives upon. The barbed wire still surrounded them, but now it no longer meant captivity. It meant transition. Soon they would be going home, if home was even the right word for a place they barely recognized anymore. In the infirmaries, the news brought a different kind of silence. Nurses continued their routines, checking vitals, changing dressings, bringing meals, but there was a new weight to their movements. The men they had cared for were no longer enemy combatants. They were simply men, wounded and waiting to return to a homeland shattered by war. For many of the prisoners, the realization was overwhelming. They had come into the camps prepared to die in disgrace, but they would be leaving alive. And not only alive, many were stronger, healthier, even hopeful, thanks to the people they had once called enemies. Letters began appearing on the nurses' desks in the weeks before repatriation. Some were written carefully in Japanese, others in halting English painstakingly learned during captivity. They were filled with words that the writers might never have spoken aloud. "You cared for me when I believed I did not deserve care," one began. "I was your enemy, and you treated me as a man." Another read, "I go home with a body healed and a heart changed. I will teach my children that kindness is stronger than hate." The nurses collected these letters in shoe boxes and desk drawers, reading them late at night under the dim light of lanterns. Many wept over them. They had never expected gratitude. They had done their duty because it was right, and yet to know that their care had left such an imprint gave meaning to the long, exhausting months they had spent in those wards. On the day of departure, the camps were filled with a strange mixture of anticipation and melancholy. Prisoners lined up in orderly rows, dressed in new uniforms issued by their captors, carrying small bundles of personal belongings. Trucks arrived to take them to the ports where ships waited to carry them back across the Pacific. As they boarded, many paused to bow deeply to the medical staff who attended to them, gestures of respect that transcended language. Some slipped folded letters into the nurses' hands. Others offered small gifts they had crafted from scrap wood or twisted wire, a carved bird, a hand-polished stone, a piece of embroidery stitched with the word peace. For the prisoners, Leaving the camps meant stepping into an uncertain future. They knew their homeland was devastated. Cities reduced to ashes, families scattered, an emperor's voice now heard in surrender rather than command. But they also carried something unexpected, a new way of seeing those they had been taught to hate. They had arrived believing that Americans were brutal, arrogant, and soulless. They left with a memory of hands that had dressed their wounds, voices that had comforted them through fevered nights, and strangers who had treated them not as enemies but as human beings. For the nurses, too, the departure was bittersweet. They had spent months, some years, caring for these men, watching them change from hardened soldiers into quiet, reflective survivors. Many had entered the war consumed by anger over Pearl Harbor or the loss of loved ones. They emerged with a deeper understanding of their own humanity, realizing that compassion did not erase their grief, but transformed it into something larger. The faces that once stirred resentment now stirred sympathy, and the hatred that once felt justified now seemed hollow in the light of shared suffering. As the ships pulled away from the docks, a final exchange passed between captors and captives. A few prisoners raised their hands in farewell. Some saluted. Others simply watched in silence, their eyes lingering on the figures in white uniforms who had once seemed so alien. And in that moment, something unspoken hung in the air, a recognition that the war had changed them all in ways no victory or defeat could measure. When the men returned to Japan, they carried more than healed bodies. They brought with them stories that challenged the narratives they had once believed. They spoke of nurses who had learned their names, of doctors who had saved their lives without hesitation, of kindness shown when none was expected. These stories spread quietly through devastated towns and villages, planting seeds of understanding that would take root in the post-war years. In time, they would help shape a new relationship between two former enemies, one built not on conquest or vengeance, but on the memory of bandaged wounds, shared meals, and letters written from hospital beds. It was a legacy born not on the battlefield, but in the quiet, human spaces where war's hatred had begun to unravel. In the decades after the war ended, the men who had once lain helpless in American infirmaries returned home to a country that no longer resembled the empire they had left behind. Cities had been reduced to rubble, the economy was shattered, and the institutions that once embodied imperial strength were gone. Yet amid the ruins, a new Japan began to emerge, one shaped not only by defeat and reconstruction, but also by memories carried home from prison camps thousands of miles away. Among those memories were not just images of bombs and battles, but of white uniforms, clean bandages, and gentle hands. These experiences, quiet and deeply personal, would ripple outward in ways few could have predicted, influencing Japan's approach to medicine, public health, and even its understanding of what it meant to be a strong nation. Historians now see a clear thread running from the infirmaries of American POW camps to Japan's post-war transformation. Many of the returning prisoners, especially officers, medics, and educated soldiers, had seen firsthand a system of care that dwarfed anything they had known. They had witnessed the efficiency of field hospitals, the discipline of organized public health protocols, and the extraordinary scale of logistics that ensured no patient, not even an enemy, went untreated. They returned to a country where hospitals were overcrowded and underfunded, where medical education lagged behind, and where public health initiatives were fragmented and inconsistent. The contrast was impossible to ignore. In the years that followed, those same men would become doctors, administrators, policymakers, and teachers. And whether consciously or not, they carried with them the lessons they had learned on the other side of the barbed wire. One of the most profound changes was in the way Japan viewed healthcare as a public good. Before the war, medical care was often reserved for those who could afford it, and public health initiatives were sporadic at best. But the example set by American military medicine, with its emphasis on universal treatment and prevention, influenced a new generation of policymakers. They began to see healthcare not just as a service, but as a cornerstone of national strength. Vaccination campaigns, sanitation programs, and community clinics became priorities in the 1950s and 1960s, forming the foundation of a public health system that would become one of the most advanced in the world. The cultural shift went deeper still. The Bushido ideal that had once glorified death and sacrifice gave way to a new respect for life and the systems that sustained it. Strength was no longer defined solely by military power or industrial capacity, but by the ability to care for a nation's people, to heal, to nurture, and prevent suffering before it began. The old notion that mercy was weakness was replaced by the understanding that mercy, when backed by discipline and organization, was a form of strength in itself. This transformation was not immediate, and it did not erase the scars of the war, but it changed the trajectory of Japanese society in subtle and lasting ways. The influence of those wartime nurses reached across the Pacific as well. For many Americans, the experience of caring for enemy prisoners reshaped their own understanding of duty. They had entered the war determined to defeat Japan, but in the act of saving Japanese lives, they had discovered a deeper calling. Compassion, they realized, was not a betrayal of their mission, but an affirmation of it, a way of proving that their nation's ideals were stronger than hatred. Many carried that lesson into their post-war lives, working in hospitals, public health agencies, and humanitarian organizations that would shape America's role in the world during the second half of the 20th century. The legacy of those encounters still lingers today, woven into the fabric of both nations. Japan's universal healthcare system, its emphasis on preventive medicine, and its cultural reverence for medical professionals all bear the subtle imprint of lessons learned in captivity. The United States, too, continues to view the humane treatment of enemies as a strategic and moral imperative, a principle born not only from international law, but from lived experience. The idea that compassion can be as powerful as firepower, that saving lives can be a form of victory, remains one of the most enduring legacies of the Second World War. For the men who once believed that capture was worse than death, those lessons were deeply personal. Many never spoke publicly about their time in American hospitals, but their children and grandchildren grew up in a society profoundly shaped by what they had witnessed. In the end, the nurses who worked in those wards did more than stitch wounds and lower fevers. They challenged centuries-old beliefs about honor and strength. They planted the seeds of a new vision of society, one where care itself could be a form of power. And though their work was quiet, often unnoticed, its echoes would resonate far beyond the war they had been sent to fight, reminding future generations that humanity's greatest victories are sometimes won not with weapons, but with hands that heal,